3 properties, 3 generations, 30 years of tragedy. The Kennedy family built their American dynasty from 3 estates, a compound on Cape Cod, a winter retreat in Palm Beach, and a chaotic Virginia manor. These houses witnessed the rise of the most powerful political family in American history, and they witnessed something else. A pattern of loss so consistent, so relentless, that people began to call it a curse. Joseph Kennedy bought the Hyannis Port compound in 1928 with a clear vision. He would create an American aristocracy, not through inherited titles, but through wealth, ambition, and relentless competition. The compound became his training ground. 9 children raised to win at everything: politics, business, even touch football on the lawn. For a brief moment in the early 1960s, it worked. His son was president. The compound became the summer White House. Photographers captured images of an American royal family at play, sailing, laughing, living the dream Joe Kennedy had built. But the houses also witnessed what came after: deaths that seemed too frequent to be coincidence, scandals that destroyed reputations, empty bedrooms that multiplied with each passing decade. By the time the last of Joe Kennedy's children passed away, the properties that had symbolized power and glamour had become monuments to loss. This is the story of how those houses shaped a dynasty and witnessed its unraveling. How 3 properties became stages for both triumph and devastation. How rooms that once hosted presidents and senators eventually stood empty, filled only with memories of who had been there and who would never return. We'll explore how Joseph Kennedy strategically chose these locations to build his family's image, how the compound's competitive atmosphere forged political careers, but also created unbearable pressure, how tragedy after tragedy transformed these estates from symbols of success into reminders of how quickly fortune can turn. Let's begin in 1928, when an ambitious businessman looked at Cape Cod and saw the perfect foundation for building an American dynasty. Chapter 1. The Bootlegger Builds His Kingdom, 1928. Joseph Patrick Kennedy was an outsider who refused to stay outside. An Irish Catholic in an America dominated by Protestant elites, the son of a Boston saloon keeper and ward boss, he had made millions through methods that raised eyebrows even in the 1920s. His fortune came from multiple sources: stock market speculation using techniques that would later be restricted, film production in Hollywood, where he ran studios and allegedly had relationships with actresses, and, according to rumors that persisted for decades but were never proven in court, bootlegging during Prohibition. Kennedy always denied it, but the whispers followed him. By 1928, at age 40, Kennedy was wealthy, but wealth wasn't enough. He wanted respectability, he wanted his family to matter, and he understood that in America, location signaled status. The right address could open doors that money alone couldn't. Cape Cod was where old money summered. Protestant families with names like Lodge and Saltonstall owned estates along the Massachusetts coast. They had been there for generations, and they didn't welcome newcomers, especially not Irish Catholics who had made their money recently through questionable means. Kennedy didn't care whether they welcomed him. He was buying in anyway. The property he purchased in Hyannis Port was substantial: 6 acres on the waterfront, not 1 house, but 3. A main residence where he and his wife Rose would live, and 2 smaller houses on the same property. He was planning ahead. His children would grow up here, and when they married, they would stay here. The compound would keep the family together, under his control. The architecture was classic New England: white clapboard siding, green shutters, porches facing the water, nothing ostentatious. Kennedy understood that true wealth in WASP America didn't announce itself loudly, it whispered. The houses looked like they could have been there for generations, though they were relatively new. The location was strategic. Hyannis Port was close enough to Boston for business, far enough for privacy. The waterfront provided sailing, swimming, and recreation, but more importantly, it provided the setting Kennedy needed. If his children grew up summering on Cape Cod like the Protestant elite, they would seem like the Protestant elite. Background could be manufactured through the right address. Rose Kennedy took charge of managing the compound. As the daughter of Boston's mayor, she understood politics and image-making. She would raise their 9 children here, training them and shaping them into the dynasty Joe envisioned. The children learned early that Kennedys didn't lose. Touch football games on the lawn weren't casual play. They were competitions with winners and losers. Sailing races from the dock weren't recreation. They were tests of skill and determination. Even dinner table conversations were debates where you had to defend your position or be dismissed. Joe Kennedy believed wealth without power was meaningless, and power in America came through politics. His children would enter public service. They would win elections. They would reshape America according to the Kennedy vision. The compound was where that training would happen. The main house became the center of operations, large enough to host gatherings, formal enough to impress visitors, but designed primarily as a family headquarters. Joe's study served as a place of business. The dining room was where the family ate together, and the children learned to argue and persuade. Bedrooms housed all 9 children, often packed together. The waterfront was perhaps the most important feature. A private dock, a beach, access to Nantucket Sound. The Kennedy children spent hours swimming, sailing, and racing each other constantly. Joe believed physical competition built character and toughness. His children would be athletes as well as scholars. Rose managed the household with strict Catholic discipline, daily mass, prayers, rules about behavior and appearance. She balanced Joe's aggressive competitiveness with religious structure. The children were raised to win, but also to maintain proper appearances and moral standards, at least publicly. The neighbors in Hyannis Port weren't thrilled. Irish Catholics in their WASP sanctuary, new money pretending to be old money, children who were too loud, too competitive, too present, but there was nothing they could do. Kennedy had bought the property. He was staying, and he was already planning the next phase. One compound wasn't enough. He needed a winter headquarters too. Somewhere warm where the family could escape the New England cold and where he could conduct business away from Boston scrutiny. He was already looking at Palm Beach. The Hyannis Port purchase in 1928 was the foundation. Everything that followed, the political careers, the presidency, the tragedies, was connected back to this moment. This property, this decision to force his way into elite American society and create a dynasty that would dominate for generations. Joe Kennedy stood on the porch of his new compound and watched his children playing on the lawn. He saw future senators, possibly a president, definitely a family that would matter, that would be remembered. He couldn't see what else the compound would witness. The telegrams announcing deaths, the funeral gatherings, the empty bedrooms, the media sieges during scandals, the transformation from symbol of success to reminder of loss. In 1928, all of that was invisible. Joe Kennedy had his kingdom. Now he just had to build his dynasty. Chapter 2. 3 houses, 9 children, 1 dream. The Hyannis Port compound wasn't just one building. It was 3 houses arranged across 6 waterfront acres. And that layout was deliberate. Joe Kennedy was planning for a dynasty meant to last generations. The main house sat at the center, 2.5 stories tall with white clapboard siding and wide porches. This was where Joe and Rose lived with their 9 children when they were young. It was the center of operations, the place where decisions were made and rules were enforced. 2 smaller houses flanked the main residence. They looked similar, sharing the same architectural style and New England aesthetic, but they served a specific purpose in Joe's vision. When his sons grew up and married, they wouldn't move away. They would take these houses and remain on the compound. The family would stay together physically and politically. This was unusual even among wealthy families, who typically scattered as children formed their own households. Joe Kennedy didn't want a scattered family. He wanted concentrated power, everyone under his influence, and working toward the same goals. Rose Kennedy managed the daily operations. 9 children required constant organization. Joseph Jr. was born in 1915, John in 1917, Rosemary in 1918, Kathleen in 1920, Eunice in 1921, Patricia in 1924, Robert in 1925, Jean in 1928, and Edward in 1932. The age spread was 17 years from oldest to youngest, meaning Rose was always managing children at different stages of life, babies and teenagers at the same time. Every summer, the compound buzzed with activity, voices echoed, children ran everywhere, and motion never stopped. The layout helped manage the chaos. The main house had bedrooms for all 9 children, though they often doubled up, boys in some rooms and girls in others. Privacy was limited. You learned to exist in crowds, to compete for attention, to speak up, or be ignored. The dining room was where family culture showed itself most clearly. A long table seated all 11 family members. Joe sat at the head, Rose nearby, the children arranged by age or by Joe's current favor. Dinner wasn't a time to relax. It was education. Joe quizzed his children on current events, politics, and business news. If you hadn't read the newspaper that day, you were embarrassed at the table. He wanted them informed, alert, and ready to argue. Sometimes he took positions he didn't believe in just to force them to debate and defend ideas under pressure. Competition extended far beyond the dinner table. The lawn became a battlefield for touch football, not casual games, but serious contests. Joe kept score, and he cared deeply about who won. The message was clear: Kennedys don't lose. Second place was failure. John was smaller and frequently sick as a child, weakened by various illnesses, yet he still had to compete with Joe Jr., who was bigger, stronger, and more naturally athletic. John learned to compensate with strategy and toughness. The physical imbalance between the brothers shaped both of their personalities. The waterfront was in constant use. The compound had a private dock extending into Nantucket Sound and several sailboats. The children spent hours racing each other on the water. Joe watched from the porch, noting who won, who quit, and who showed determination when falling behind. Swimming was mandatory. The water was cold, but that didn't matter. Joe believed comfort made you soft. His children would be tough and endure discomfort without complaint. Rose reinforced this belief with religious discipline. Suffering, she taught them, built character. Rose's influence was different from Joe's, but just as strong. She was deeply Catholic and insisted on daily prayers. Sunday Mass was non-negotiable. She took the children to church in Hyannis Village, where they sat together, highly visible as a large Catholic family that didn't quite fit into Protestant Cape Cod society. She enforced strict standards of appearance and behavior, especially for the daughters. How you looked and how you dressed mattered. The Kennedys were being watched, and they needed to project success, discipline, and control. At the same time, Rose provided affection that Joe rarely showed. She read to the younger children, comforted them when they were sick, and created warmth in a household that Joe's competitiveness could make harsh. The balance between Joe's demands and Rose's care defined the compound's atmosphere. Summers followed a strict rhythm: morning athletics, afternoon sailing or at the beach. Evenings with Joe, quizzing and pushing them, preparing them for lives in public service. Weekends brought visitors, politicians, businessmen, and anyone Joe believed his children should meet and learn from. But even in these early years, signs of strain appeared. Rosemary, the third child and first daughter, struggled to keep up. She learned more slowly than her siblings and lacked their physical coordination. In a family obsessed with competition and winning, this was impossible to ignore. She tried hard but couldn't match her brothers and sisters. Joe and Rose initially hoped she would catch up. They hired tutors and sent her to special schools. But as the years passed, the gap widened. In family football games, she couldn't keep up. At dinner debates, she couldn't follow the rapid exchanges. Most of the other children were kind to her, and Kathleen in particular watched out for her. But the competitive culture was unforgiving to anyone who couldn't compete. Rosemary felt the difference. She knew she was disappointing her father. Joe Kennedy's vision depended on all his children succeeding and contributing to the family's rise. A child who couldn't do that threatened the image he was building. The consequences of this wouldn't become clear until the 1940s. In the 1930s, the compound was largely what Joe envisioned, a training ground where his children learned to win, compete, and present themselves as future leaders. The houses themselves became part of that training. You lived in public, even within the family. You learned to perform, to maintain appearances, and never to show weakness. Neighbors in Hyannis Port grew accustomed to the Kennedy chaos. Loud football games, constant activity, children everywhere. Some disapproved. The Kennedys were still outsiders, Irish Catholic in a predominantly WASP environment, still new money pretending otherwise. Joe Kennedy no longer cared. He had what he wanted: the property, the location, the foundation of his dynasty. As his older sons approached college age, Joe made his intentions clear. Joseph Jr. was being groomed for politics. He would go to Harvard, then law school, then Congress, then the Senate, possibly even the presidency. The entire family structure revolved around Joe Jr.'s future career. John, the second son, was the backup plan. He understood this hierarchy, living in his older brother's shadow, often sick and more introspective, trying to find his place. By the late 1930s, the compound had become a Kennedy kingdom, a place where outsiders became insiders through money and willpower. But Joe was already thinking ahead. Hyannis Port worked for Summers, but he wanted a winter headquarters too, somewhere away from Boston and New York scrutiny. He looked south toward Florida and Palm Beach, imagining a second court for his growing dynasty. Hyannis Port was the foundation, but it was only the beginning. Chapter 3. The Winter Palace. In 1933, America was deep in the Great Depression. Banks had collapsed, unemployment reached 25%, families lost homes, and bread lines stretched around city blocks. Joe Kennedy was not suffering. He had seen the crash coming and pulled his money out in time. While others lost everything, he remained wealthy and was about to become wealthier through the desperation of others. Palm Beach, Florida, had been a playground for millionaires in the 1920s. Enormous Mediterranean revival estates lined the Atlantic coast, complete with red tile roofs, arched windows, tropical gardens, and private beaches. The Depression changed that. Many of the families who built those mansions were no longer wealthy. They needed to sell, and properties that once cost millions were now available for a fraction of their original price. Joe Kennedy was watching. The estate he chose was called La Corrida. It wasn't the largest mansion in Palm Beach, but it was substantial, elegant, and well located on North Ocean Boulevard, the most prestigious address in the area. It included a main house, manicured grounds, a pool, and Atlantic Ocean frontage. The price reflected the seller's desperation. Joe made an offer, and it was accepted. By late 1933, the Kennedy family had a second headquarters: Hyannis Port for summer, Palm Beach for winter. 2 courts for an American dynasty. Each property served a different purpose. Hyannis Port was where the children trained, competed, and learned toughness. It was noisy, chaotic, and intense. Palm Beach was more formal and refined. The Mediterranean architecture signaled sophistication rather than rugged New England simplicity. Joe used Palm Beach differently. This was where he conducted business he didn't want scrutinized in Boston or New York, where he hosted people and made deals away from northern eyes. Rose adapted to managing 2 households with military precision. 9 children, staff at both properties, constant travel between Massachusetts and Florida. It required strict organization. A yearly rhythm developed: summers in Hyannis Port, school months in Boston, winters and holidays in Palm Beach, then back north again. The constant movement became normal for the children. Palm Beach exposed them to a different level of wealth and power, national rather than regional. Joe wanted his children to meet these people and understand how real power worked. Palm Beach also provided privacy. Cape Cod was small, and the Kennedys were always visible there. Palm Beach estates were spread out, hidden behind walls and tropical landscaping. Joe could work without neighbors watching. For the children, Palm Beach meant pools instead of cold water sailing, tennis instead of rocky shores. The pace was slightly slower, though competition remained constant. The daughters especially enjoyed Palm Beach's social scene. It was more sophisticated than Hyannis Port, with parties and dances that drew people from across the country. Kathleen, known as Kick, thrived in this environment, but the constant movement also created pressure. The children lived nowhere long enough to form deep roots outside the family. Friends were temporary. The family itself became their primary social world, increasing Joe's control, but also isolating them. As Joe Jr. and John entered adulthood, the properties became showcases. They invited friends from Harvard and elsewhere, using the estates to impress and demonstrate status. Rosemary's struggles became more obvious, especially in Palm Beach's formal setting. She couldn't follow conversations the way her siblings could. Social situations were difficult for her. Tutors and schools couldn't close the gap. By the late 1930s, Joe Kennedy had risen to national prominence. In 1937, he was appointed ambassador to Britain. It was the peak of his ambitions, proof that an Irish Catholic outsider had forced his way into the center of power. But his ambassadorship was short-lived. His views on Europe and the coming war damaged his reputation, and he resigned in 1940. The estates became refugees. Joe's own political career had failed, which meant his dynasty now depended entirely on his sons. By 1941, Hyannis Port and Palm Beach were fully established as Kennedy power centers. Deals were made there, plans formed, and the next generation prepared for public life. Together, the two estates represented different faces of Kennedy ambition. Hyannis Port was competitive and aggressive. Palm Beach was elegant and calculated. Both would soon witness tragedy. War was coming, and it would change everything. The houses built to showcase success would become places of mourning. In 1941, that future wasn't visible yet. Joe Kennedy had his kingdom, 2 estates, and 9 children being prepared for greatness, and everything seemed to be going according to plan. Chapter 4. Rosemary, the daughter who disappeared. Rosemary Kennedy was born in 1918, the 3rd child and eldest daughter of Joe and Rose Kennedy. In her early years, nothing seemed obviously different. She was a beautiful child, smiling in family photographs and playing alongside her siblings. But as she grew older, the gap between Rosemary and the rest of the Kennedy children became increasingly clear. She learned to read later than her brothers. Her handwriting remained childish, while theirs improved, and physical coordination came more slowly to her. In a household defined by constant competition, fast-paced debate, and sharp intellect, Rosemary struggled to keep up. Dinner conversations moved quickly, and those who couldn't match the pace were dismissed. Rosemary fell behind. The exact nature of her condition was never formally diagnosed. Some historians believe it may have been caused by oxygen deprivation during birth. Her delivery was difficult, and there are accounts suggesting that a nurse delayed the birth until the doctor arrived, possibly causing brain injury, though this was never medically confirmed. What was clear was that Rosemary had intellectual disabilities. In modern terms, she might be described as having an intellectual developmental disorder. Her IQ was later estimated to be around 70, though testing at the time was imprecise. She could read and write at an elementary level and hold simple conversations, but complex reasoning was beyond her reach. Joe and Rose tried everything. They enrolled her in special schools, hired private tutors, and experimented with different educational approaches. They hoped that with enough effort and resources, Rosemary would eventually catch up. She didn't. By her teenage years, it was obvious she would never match her siblings intellectually. This reality posed a serious problem for Joe Kennedy's vision of a flawless dynasty. His plan depended on successful, accomplished children, and Rosemary's limitations threatened the image he was carefully constructing. He worried about her future, whether she would be taken advantage of, whether she would embarrass the family. Rose tried to include Rosemary in normal family life at Hyannis Port and Palm Beach. She brought her to social events, dressed her beautifully, and coached her on what to say. Rosemary tried hard. She wanted to make her parents proud, but her effort was visible, and the results were inconsistent. Her siblings generally treated her kindly, with Kathleen especially watching over her, but kindness couldn't change the underlying reality. While her brothers debated politics, Rosemary sat quietly. While her sisters navigated complex social situations, Rosemary needed guidance for even simple ones. The gap between her abilities and theirs grew more apparent with each passing year. As Rosemary entered her 20s, new fears emerged. She was a beautiful young woman who attended dances and social events and showed interest in young men. Joe worried about her vulnerability. He believed her intellectual limitations made her incapable of sound judgment and feared she could be exploited or become pregnant. There were also claims that her behavior had become more difficult to manage, with mood swings and occasional aggression when frustrated. Historians still debate whether these accounts were accurate or exaggerated to justify what came next. In 1941, Joe made a decision. He had heard of a new medical procedure being promoted as a treatment for behavioral and intellectual conditions: lobotomy. The procedure involved severing connections in the brain's frontal lobe. It was experimental, its success uncertain, and its risks enormous. Joe convinced himself it might help Rosemary, or perhaps that it would make her easier to manage. Accounts differ on his exact motivation, but what is certain is that he arranged the procedure without fully informing Rose. Some historians believe she was told nothing. Others say the risks were downplayed. Either way, Rose was not present for the decision or the surgery. In November 1941, at age 23, Rosemary underwent the procedure at George Washington University Hospital. The doctors kept her awake during the surgery, asking her to recite prayers and sing songs. When she could no longer respond coherently, they knew they had cut enough. The operation was a catastrophe. Rosemary emerged with the mental capacity of a 2-year-old. She could barely walk. Her speech was largely gone, and she was incontinent. A woman who had struggled but maintained independence was now completely incapacitated. Joe immediately placed her in an institution, first in a psychiatric hospital in upstate New York, and later in 1949 at St. Coletta School in Wisconsin, a Catholic facility for people with developmental disabilities. Rosemary would spend the rest of her life there, never returning to Hyannis Port or Palm Beach. The family told the younger children that Rosemary was teaching intellectually disabled students at a school in Wisconsin. This became the official story, and many believed it for years. Visiting was discouraged. Joe claimed it would upset Rosemary to see family and then watch them leave. Rose eventually learned the truth. Her reaction was never fully documented, but she was reportedly devastated. Her daughter had been permanently damaged by a procedure she had not fully understood or approved. But in the Kennedy family, you did not contradict Joe. Rose accepted the situation, though it clearly caused her great pain. Rosemary's bedroom remained at Hyannis Port, but she was gone. Her siblings were told not to discuss her. The family presented a flawless public image: successful, accomplished, perfect. Rosemary no longer fit that image, so she was erased from the story. The decision haunted the family. Years later, some siblings expressed guilt over failing to protect her, especially Kathleen, who felt she had let Rosemary down. Rosemary lived at St. Coletta for decades. The family paid for her care but rarely visited. Joe never saw her again. He couldn't face what he had done. Rose visited occasionally but infrequently. The younger siblings weren't allowed to see Rosemary until they were adults and could decide for themselves. The truth remained hidden until the 1960s, when the family's public prominence made secrecy impossible. Rosemary's fate reflected both the medical ignorance of the era and Joe Kennedy's ruthless commitment to image and control. Intellectual disability was poorly understood, and lobotomy was seen by some as progressive medicine. But Joe's decision to proceed without Rose's full knowledge and his willingness to permanently hide Rosemary when it failed revealed how far he would go to preserve the illusion of perfection. The estates at Hyannis Port in Palm Beach were stages for Kennedy's success. Rosemary's story showed what happened when a Kennedy didn't fit the narrative. You were removed, hidden, and forgotten. Rosemary Kennedy lived until 2005. She spent 64 years institutionalized because of a procedure meant to help her. When her siblings finally learned the full truth, many were horrified. Some became advocates for people with intellectual disabilities, perhaps seeking redemption. But in 1941, Rosemary simply vanished from Kennedy family life. The daughter who tried so hard to meet impossible standards was gone. She was the first Kennedy sacrificed for the dynasty's image, and she would not be the last. Chapter 5. War Comes Home, 1944. The telegram arrived at Hyannis Port on August 13, 1944. A Western Union messenger delivered it to the main house. Joe Kennedy opened it. His eldest son, Joseph Patrick Kennedy Jr., was dead. After Pearl Harbor in December 1941, all the Kennedy sons of fighting age had enlisted. Joe Jr. joined the Navy and trained as a pilot. John joined as well, eventually commanding a patrol torpedo boat in the Pacific. Even Robert, still too young for combat, prepared to serve. For Joe Jr., military service was part of the plan. War would make him a hero, and heroism translated into political capital. His father had mapped out his future precisely: distinguished service, a return home, a run for Congress, and eventually the presidency. Everything had been proceeding according to design until John's experience came first. In August 1943, John's PT boat was rammed by a Japanese destroyer in the Solomon Islands. The boat split in half, killing 2 crew members. John and the survivors swam to a small island, with John towing an injured crewman for hours by clenching the man's life jacket strap in his teeth. They survived for days before rescue. The story made newspapers, and Joe ensured it received maximum publicity. John was awarded the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for heroism and returned home in early 1944 as a certified war hero. Joe Jr. watched all of this unfold. His younger brother, long seen as the backup, was now celebrated nationwide. The rivalry that had defined their childhood intensified. Joe Jr. needed to match or surpass his brother's heroism. He volunteered for Operation Aphrodite, an experimental and extremely dangerous mission involving bomber planes packed with explosives. Pilots were to fly toward targets, arm the explosives, set autopilot and parachute out before impact. Many things could and did go wrong. On August 12, 1944, Joe Jr. and his co-pilot took off from England. Witnesses in escort planes saw a massive explosion in midair over the English countryside. The bomber disintegrated instantly. Both men were killed, leaving almost nothing behind. The explosion was so complete that no bodies could be recovered. Back at Hyannis Port, the family was gathered for the summer. Rose had been at church when the telegram arrived. Joe received the news alone. When Rose returned, he told her, their firstborn son, the one they had invested everything in, the future president, was gone. The family gathered in the living room. Rose wept. The younger children struggled to understand. John, still recovering from his injuries, now carried the burden his brother had been meant to bear. Joe Jr.'s bedroom remained untouched, preserved like a shrine. His trophies, photographs, and books stayed exactly where he had left them. Joe couldn't face closing the door. The war that was supposed to produce Kennedy heroes had instead taken the family's centerpiece. Joe aged visibly in the months that followed. His drive wasn't gone, but it was damaged. At the same time, another loss struck. Kathleen had married William Cavendish, Marquis of Hartington, against her parents' wishes. 4 months later, he was killed in combat. Kathleen, now widowed at 24, chose to remain in England. This independence created tension with her parents, who expected their children to stay close and under their influence. By late 1944, the family compound felt different. One son was dead. One was injured and traumatized. A daughter had married outside the faith and remained abroad. The war had brought loss instead of advancement. Joe Jr.'s death forced a painful shift. John would now have to take his place as the political heir, a role he had never been prepared for. The pressure transferred from the dead son to the living one. Rose coped through faith, turning increasingly to prayer. The younger children watched and learned the family rule. Individual desires were secondary to the dynasty. By the end of 1944, the Kennedys had learned something they never believed before, that they were not invincible. The first crack had appeared in the armor of the family Joe Kennedy built. Chapter 6. Kick's Rebellion from Hyannis Port to French Alps. Kathleen Kennedy had always been different, outgoing, charming, and less intimidated by her father than her siblings at Hyannis Port. While her brothers competed brutally and her sisters tried to meet impossible standards, Kick found her own path. She was social and popular. People were drawn to her warmth and humor. The war sent her to England, where she worked for the Red Cross in London during the Blitz. Bombs fell nightly, buildings collapsed, and people died. But Kick thrived in the chaos. She attended parties, made connections, and met William Cavendish, Marquis of Hartington, heir to the Duke of Devonshire. William came from one of England's most prominent aristocratic families, Chatsworth House, vast estates, centuries of lineage. He was Protestant. Kick was Catholic. The religious divide created problems immediately. Joe Kennedy saw political advantage in the match. His daughter marrying into British aristocracy would cement Kennedy legitimacy, but Rose saw betrayal. Catholic doctrine was clear. Marrying outside the church was unacceptable. If Kik married a Protestant in a Protestant ceremony, she'd be committing mortal sin. Kik loved William. The religion problem seemed like something they could work around. They'd raise children Catholic. They agreed. But that wasn't enough for Rose. The ceremony itself mattered. A Protestant ceremony meant Kik would be excommunicated in Catholic eyes. The wedding happened in May 1944, a civil ceremony not in a church. Rose refused to attend. Joe attended, seeing the political benefits, but the family was divided. Kik was choosing love and independence over her mother's approval. 4 months later, William was killed in combat, a sniper in Belgium. September 1944. Kik was a widow at 24. She could have returned to America, to Hyannis Port, to family. Instead, she stayed in England. The Cavendish family welcomed her. She was their son's widow. They gave her rooms at their estates, included her in family affairs. For the first time, Kik wasn't defined primarily as a Kennedy. She was Lady Hartington. She had her own identity, her own place in society. Rose wanted her home, back to America, back to proper Catholic life, back under family control. But Kik refused. England was where she'd been happy with William, where she'd found acceptance. She'd visit America occasionally, but wouldn't move back. The years after William's death were complicated. Kik grieved, but also enjoyed her independence. She had money from the Cavendish family. She had social status. She moved in aristocratic circles. She was free from both her father's ambitions and her mother's religious strictures. Then she met Peter Fitzwilliam, Earl Fitzwilliam, enormously wealthy, charming, sophisticated, and married. He was separated from his wife, but not divorced. Catholic doctrine made this even worse than her first marriage. Dating a married man was absolutely forbidden. Kik didn't care. She'd already broken with church teaching by marrying Protestant. She'd chosen her own path once. She could do it again. She and Peter began a relationship that scandalized both the Cavendish family and her own. Joe Kennedy heard about the relationship and was furious. Not because of Catholic morality. Joe had never been particularly religious, but because the scandal could damage the family's image. John was beginning his political career, and a sister openly dating a married man could hurt him. According to multiple accounts, though details vary, Joe threatened to cut Kik off financially if she continued with Peter. He demanded she end the relationship, choose family loyalty over personal happiness, return to being a proper Kennedy daughter. Kik had a different plan. Peter's divorce would eventually come through. They'd marry. She'd face whatever consequences came. She'd already lost one husband. She wasn't going to lose another man she loved because her father disapproved. In May 1948, Kik and Peter planned a trip to the south of France. They'd discuss their future, make plans, possibly announce their engagement. They chartered a small private plane to fly from Paris to Cannes. The weather was terrible. A storm system over the Rhone Valley. Their pilot advised against flying, but they had reservations, plans. They decided to go anyway. The plane took off from Paris on May 13th, 1948. The storm was worse than anticipated. The small plane struggled. Visibility was near zero. The pilot tried to navigate through the weather, somewhere over the French Alps, probably trying to find a way through the mountains. The plane struck a peak. Everyone aboard died instantly. Kik was 28 years old. Peter was 37. They were found days later when search parties finally located the wreckage high in the mountains. The news reached Hyannis Port by telegram. Another telegram announcing another death. Rose received it with complicated emotions. Her daughter was dead, but her daughter had also been living in sin with a married man. Rose's grief was mixed with a sense that this was somehow judgment for Kik's choices. Joe Sr. was devastated. Whatever anger he'd felt about Peter, Kik was still his daughter, the charming, independent child who'd brightened the compound. Gone. He'd threatened to cut her off financially. Now she was dead, and those threats were the last significant interaction they'd had. Neither Joe nor Rose attended the funeral. It was held in England in the Cavendish family plot. The official explanation was that Joe couldn't travel due to health concerns, but many believed the real reason was that attending would mean acknowledging Kik's relationship with Peter. The Kennedys wouldn't publicly validate what they'd privately condemned. The Cavendish family buried Kik with full honors. She was Lady Hartington, William's widow. That's how England remembered her. The Kennedy family's absence was noted and created awkwardness. Their daughter was being buried, and they weren't there. At Hyannis Port, Kick's absence became permanent, like Rosemary before her, though for different reasons. Rosemary had been hidden because she didn't fit the success narrative. Kick was gone because she'd chosen independence over family control. The pattern was emerging. Kennedy children who followed the script, Joe Jr. before his death, John now entering politics, were celebrated. Those who deviated were lost. Rosemary institutionalized, Kick dead, after refusing to return to the family orbit. The dynasty required conformity. Rose processed Kick's death through a religious framework. Her daughter had strayed from church teaching, married a Protestant, then dated a married man. The plane crash, in Rose's view, might have been divine intervention preventing worse sin. She prayed for Kick's soul, but also seemed to believe the death carried meaning. Joe Sr. couldn't intellectualize it that way. He'd lost 2 children in 4 years, Joe Jr., the heir to everything he'd built, and Kick, the daughter who'd actually seemed happy, even if she'd chosen happiness outside family plans. The cost of the dynasty was becoming clear. The dining room at Hyannis Port, where all the Kennedy children had once gathered, now had 2 empty chairs, Joe Jr.'s place, Kick's place. The table was smaller. The competitive energy that had defined family meals was diminished. Death had entered the compound twice now, and both times it had taken children who were supposed to be part of the dynasty's future. John was in his early 30s, beginning his political career. He'd lost his older brother and one of his favorite sisters within 4 years. The family that had seemed invincible when he was growing up was revealing itself to be fragile. Success and loss were intertwined in ways his father had never acknowledged. The compound's meaning was shifting. It had been built as a training ground for success, but it was becoming a place where the family gathered to process loss, where telegrams arrived announcing deaths, where empty bedrooms reminded everyone of who was gone. By 1948, only 7 of Joe and Rose's 9 children remained. Rosemary was alive but gone, locked away in Wisconsin. Joe Jr. and Kick were dead. The family that was supposed to conquer American politics was being diminished by forces Joe couldn't control. The cursed narrative was still years away. In 1948, people just saw tragic coincidences. A war death, a plane crash, sad, but not supernatural. But the pattern had started. Kennedy ambition meeting Kennedy loss. The dynasty requiring sacrifices its architect hadn't anticipated. Kick's rebellion had ended in French mountains. Her refusal to conform, to return to Hyannis Port, to accept family control, had led her to that plane. Whether different choices would have saved her is unknowable. But her death reinforced the family's belief that leaving the Kennedy orbit was dangerous, that independence from the dynasty led to disaster. The message was clear to the surviving children. Stay close. Follow the plan. Deviation was deadly. The compound was safety. Leaving led to loss. Whether this was true or just what the family needed to believe to make sense of tragedy, it became Kennedy doctrine. 2 more empty chairs, 2 more closed bedrooms. The compound built for dynasty was becoming a museum of loss. Chapter 7. The Rise. JFK takes the compound. John Fitzgerald Kennedy never wanted to be a politician. He'd thought about journalism, maybe teaching. Writing interested him. His senior thesis at Harvard became a book, Why England Slept, about British appeasement before the war. He saw himself as an observer and analyst, not a participant in the arena. But Joe Jr. was dead. Someone had to fulfill Joe Sr.'s vision, and John was the only remaining option among the older sons. Robert was too young, still finishing school. It had to be John. His father made this clear. The family needed this. Joe Jr.'s death couldn't mean the end of Kennedy political ambitions. John's war injuries gave him problems. His back was damaged from the PT boat collision. He'd contracted malaria in the Pacific. He was often in pain, but the injuries also gave him a narrative. The war hero who'd saved his crew. His father ensured that story was told and retold. It became the foundation for John's political identity. In 1946, John ran for Congress from Massachusetts' 11th District, covering parts of Boston and Cambridge, working-class areas, Irish Catholic neighborhoods, the kind of places where Kennedy name recognition helped. The campaign was run from Hyannis Port when possible. Joe Sr. coordinated everything, strategy sessions at the main house, Phone calls from his study. The compound became campaign headquarters. Money flowed from Joe's fortune. Nothing was left to chance. John won easily. At 29, he was Congressman Kennedy. He moved to Washington but returned to Hyannis Port regularly. The compound remained home base where he recharged, where he got instructions from his father, where the family gathered to plan next moves. Being a congressman wasn't enough. Joe Sr. aimed higher, Senate, then presidency. The path Joe Jr. was supposed to take, John would now follow. The timetable was aggressive. John was young, but youth could be an advantage if marketed correctly. In 1952, John ran for Senate against Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr. Lodge was an incumbent, well-established, from one of Massachusetts' most prominent old families, the kind of WASP aristocrat Joe Kennedy had spent decades trying to match. The campaign was brutal and expensive. Joe Sr. spent whatever it took. He called in every favor, used every connection. The Kennedy political machine based from Hyannis Port operated at full capacity. Robert, just out of law school, managed the campaign. The family was all in. John won. Senator Kennedy at age 35. The victory was significant. A Kennedy had beaten a Lodge. Irish Catholic New Money had defeated Protestant Old Money. It validated everything Joe Sr. had worked toward, but John's personal life remained unsettled. He dated various women, society girls, actresses, nothing serious. His father wanted him married. A politician needed a wife, especially if he was aiming for the presidency. Bachelor senators raised questions about stability and character. John met Jacqueline Bouvier at a dinner party in 1951. She was 12 years younger, sophisticated, beautiful, from a wealthy background, though not as wealthy as the Kennedys. She'd been educated in Europe. She spoke French fluently. She had the Polish the Kennedys sometimes lacked despite their money. They married in September 1953 in Newport, Rhode Island. A massive wedding, over 800 guests. Jackie wore a gown with 50 yards of silk. The reception was at her family's estate, Hammersmith Farm. It was the society event of the season, but Jackie's introduction to the Kennedy family dynamic was jarring. She'd grown up in a quieter, more refined environment. The Kennedy compound was chaos by comparison. Loud voices, constant competition, touch football games where she was expected to participate, political discussions where everyone talked over each other. Joe Sr. claimed one of the smaller houses on the Hyannis Port compound for John and Jackie. This was the original plan. His sons would live on the property even after marriage. John's house was steps from his parents'. Privacy was limited. Jackie found this suffocating. The competitive atmosphere that John had grown up with struck Jackie as childish. Grown men keeping score in touch football games. Sisters competing over who had the best outfit. Political one-upmanship at dinner. Everyone constantly trying to prove they were the smartest, fastest, most accomplished Kennedy in the room. Jackie retreated when she could. She'd escape to her own family's properties, find excuses to be elsewhere. The Kennedy compound, which was supposed to be a dynasty headquarters, felt to her like a pressure cooker where she couldn't breathe. But the compound served its political purpose. Photographers came to capture the young senator at home with his beautiful wife. Images of John and Jackie at Hyannis Port appeared in magazines. The sailboat, the beach, the casual elegance of summer on Cape Cod. It sold the Kennedy brand effectively. John's political career continued its rise. He wrote another book, Profiles in Courage, about senators who'd taken principled but unpopular stands. Published in 1956, it became a bestseller and won the Pulitzer Prize. Questions later emerged about how much John actually wrote versus how much was written by speechwriter Ted Sorensen. But the book enhanced John's intellectual image. By the mid-1950s, the Kennedy compound was operating as it was designed to. Political strategy developed there. Family meetings, coordinated campaigns. The property's prestige added to the family's image, and John was positioned for the next step, the presidency. Joe Sr.'s health was declining. He'd turned 70 in 1958. His energy wasn't what it had been, but his ambition for his sons hadn't diminished. If anything, losing Joe Jr. made him more determined that John would reach the presidency. The dynasty couldn't end. It had to continue through the next generation. The compound also served as refuge from Washington. John's Senate work was often tedious. Committee meetings, constituent services, the day-to-day mechanics of legislation. But at Hyannis Port, he could relax somewhat. Sail, swim, spend time with family. The compound represented escape from political grind, even as it remained political headquarters. Jackie struggled with this duality. She wanted a private life, separate from constant Kennedy family involvement, but that wasn't how the family operated. Everything was shared, everything was discussed. Privacy was viewed as selfishness. The family came first, always. She also struggled with the compound's casual approach to infidelity. Joe Sr. had affairs throughout his marriage to Rose. This was known and tolerated within the family. John followed his father's pattern. He had relationships with various women even after marriage. At the compound, this was accepted as normal behavior for Kennedy men. Jackie knew, everyone knew, but the family expectation was that you didn't make it public. You maintained appearances, you stood by your husband. That's what Rose had done. That's what Kennedy wives did. Jackie found this arrangement painful, but learned to navigate it. By 1958, John was preparing for a presidential run. The compound would be central to the campaign. Family meetings to plan strategy, photo opportunities showing the vibrant Kennedy clan. The properties, Hyannis Port and Palm Beach, would project success, youth, vigor. Everything Joe Sr. had built toward was approaching fulfillment. John's house on the compound became his operational base when he wasn't in Washington. Staff, security, communications equipment. The small house that had been part of the original compound purchase was now the home of a potential president. The transformation was complete. The property Joe bought in 1928 as an outsider forcing his way into WASP society had become the headquarters of a political dynasty. The Irish Catholic family that wasn't supposed to belong was now producing a senator who might become president. Joe Sr. stood on the main house porch and looked at his remaining children. Joe Jr. and Kick were gone. Rosemary was institutionalized, but John was a senator. Robert was becoming a skilled political operator. The younger children were developing. The dynasty was working despite the losses. The compound had witnessed death and grief, but it had also been the training ground for success. The competitive atmosphere, the constant pressure, the relentless push for achievement. It had all served its purpose. At least one Kennedy was reaching the heights Joe had envisioned. In 1958, the future looked bright. John would run for president. He'd probably win. The compound would become the summer White House. Everything was proceeding according to the revised plan. What Joe couldn't see was that the brightest moment would also mark the beginning of the darkest period. That success and tragedy were about to intertwine in ways that would haunt the compound forever, that the properties he'd built to showcase Kennedy triumph would become monuments to Kennedy loss. But in 1958, standing on his porch at Hyannis Port, Joe Kennedy believed the dynasty was secure. His son would be president. The vision was becoming reality. The compound had served its purpose. Chapter 8. Bobby's Chaos, Hickory Hill. Robert Kennedy needed a place of his own. He had managed John's Senate campaign, worked in the Justice Department, and married Ethel Skakel in 1950. By the mid-1950s, they already had several children, with more on the way, and living at the Hyannis Port compound or near his parents was no longer workable. In 1955, John purchased an estate in McLean, Virginia, just outside Washington, Hickory Hill, a substantial property with a large house, expansive grounds, and a notable history as Civil War General George McClellan's headquarters. John initially intended to live there with Jackie, but when she visited, she disliked it immediately. It felt too big, too isolated, too far from Washington, and at the time she was pregnant and experiencing complications. The house felt wrong to her, and she refused to live there. In 1957, John sold the property to Robert. Bobby and Ethel loved it at once. The space, the privacy from Joe Sr.'s constant oversight, and the possibilities it offered. They moved in and transformed it into something entirely different from Hyannis Port or Palm Beach. Hickory Hill became chaos by design. Ethel wanted animals, lots of them. There was a horse named Geronimo that sometimes wandered into the house, dogs everywhere, and at one point, even a sea lion in the swimming pool, a gift that quickly proved impractical. Chickens and ducks roamed the grounds. The estate became part home, part zoo. Meanwhile, the children multiplied rapidly. Bobby and Ethel would eventually have 11 together: Kathleen, Joseph, Robert Jr., David, Mary, Courtney, Michael, Carrie, Christopher, Douglas, and Rory. The house was constantly filled with children running, shouting, and playing. The atmosphere was completely unlike Joe Sr.'s controlled compound. At Hyannis Port, competition was organized and purposeful. At Hickory Hill, it was joyful chaos. Children climbed trees, fell into the pool, and played with animals. It was structured disorder rather than regimented training. Bobby embraced this environment. He had always been the quieter, more sensitive Kennedy, less naturally aggressive than Joe Jr. or John, and more emotional than his father approved of. At Hickory Hill, away from Joe's judgment, he could create his own version of family life. The swimming pool became famous not just for swimming, but for parties. Political figures, senators, cabinet members, journalists would visit. And at some point, someone would inevitably be thrown into the pool, fully clothed, often several people. It became a Hickory Hill tradition. You weren't truly welcomed until you'd been tossed in. Ethel encouraged this wildness. Though she'd grown up wealthy, her upbringing was less formal than the Kennedys. She was more spontaneous and more willing to embrace chaos. Where Rose Kennedy had managed 9 children with strict schedules and Catholic discipline, Ethel let her children be children. Rules existed, but they were loosely enforced. The house reflected that philosophy. Toys everywhere, pet supplies, athletic equipment, clearly lived in rather than maintained as a showpiece. That was intentional. Hickory Hill wasn't meant to impress visitors with Kennedy elegance. It was a working family home where life happened loudly and messily. As John rose to the presidency, Hickory Hill became Bobby's base. When John became president in 1961, Bobby was appointed Attorney General at just 35, despite limited legal experience. The decision was controversial, but Joe Sr. believed family loyalty mattered more than conventional qualifications. Bobby worked from the Justice Department, but constantly brought work home. His study filled with files, the phone rang at all hours, staff came to the house for meetings, and political strategy sessions unfolded around the dinner table while children ate nearby. This blending of work and family was a Kennedy tradition, but Bobby's version was less formal. Advisors stepping over toys, discussions interrupted by children asking questions. The boundary between professional and personal life was permeable. The estate also became a gathering place for the extended Kennedy family. John would visit from the White House when he needed to speak privately with Bobby. Eunice, Patricia, Jane, and the rest of Bobby's sisters brought their families. Hyannis Port remained the official headquarters, but Hickory Hill emerged as an alternative power center, creating some tension with Joe Sr. He had built Hyannis Port to keep the family together under his influence. Bobby, establishing a base in Virginia, represented independence, not rebellion, but autonomy nonetheless. After Joe Sr. suffered a stroke in December 1961, leaving him partially paralyzed and unable to speak clearly, his control over the family loosened dramatically. Bobby, as Attorney General and John's closest advisor, became more autonomous, and Hickory Hill's importance as a Kennedy power center grew. The property served Bobby's political image well. Journalists who visited saw an energetic, attractive family life. Photos of Bobby playing with his children appeared in magazines, projecting vigor and warmth, the Kennedy image. But with more humanity and less of Joe Sr.'s cold calculation, Bobby was raising his children differently than he had been raised, with less pressure and more affection. He still wanted them to succeed and to serve, but he rejected the pressure cooker environment of his own childhood. Ethel was central to this balance. She managed the household chaos with remarkable tolerance. With 11 children engaged in rough play, injuries were common, broken bones, frequent emergency room visits taken in stride. The family joked that hospitals should offer them a frequent visitor discount. Athletic competitions still took place on the grounds, but with a different tone. At Hyannis Port, games were tests. Winners celebrated, losers shamed. At Hickory Hill, Bobby emphasized fun over winning, having learned the cost of his father's approach. Yet Hickory Hill was not separate from Kennedy destiny. Bobby remained deeply competitive in his work and fully committed to the family's political goals. The estate was simply where he could be a softer version of himself, where warmth he couldn't show publicly emerged with his family. It also reflected his evolution from Joe Jr.'s younger brother, then John's, always in someone else's shadow, to an attorney general with his own identity and a base of operations. Hickory Hill became the third distinct Kennedy property. Hyannis Port was competitive and controlled, Palm Beach elegant and formal, and Hickory Hill chaotic, warm, and filled with life at its messiest and noisiest. Together, they showed the family's range: public image at Hyannis Port, sophisticated retreat at Palm Beach, and real life at Hickory Hill. By 1963, Hickory Hill was firmly established as Bobby's kingdom, 11 children and counting, animals everywhere, and political power flowing through the house. Standing on the grounds watching his children play, Bobby had found a way to be a Kennedy while still being himself, serving the family mission while creating space for love and warmth. Hickory Hill was his version of what his father had built at Hyannis Port. Similar purpose, different execution, better balance. What he could not see was that the joyful chaos was temporary. Tragedy was coming, not just to Hyannis Port, but to his own home. The estate filled with children's laughter would one day know grief. In 1963, though, Hickory Hill was exactly what Bobby wanted it to be: a place of joy despite political pressure, a home where family life was genuine rather than performed. The darkness would come soon enough. In 1963, Hickory Hill was light. Chapter 9. The Summer White House. Peak Camelot. On January 20th, 1961, John Fitzgerald Kennedy took the oath as the 35th President of the United States. At 43, he was the youngest elected president in American history, an Irish Catholic, the grandson of immigrants, the son of Joe Kennedy, who had forced his way into WASP society decades earlier. Joe Sr. watched from the inaugural platform, vigorous and proud. His son was president. The dynasty was real, and everything he had built toward for years was happening. The presidency transformed Hyannis Port immediately. What had been a private family estate became the Summer White House. Secret Service agents flooded the property. Communications equipment was installed. A helipad was built on the lawn, and security fences went up. Casual access vanished. The main house required secure phone lines to Washington, space for staff, and areas for press briefings. The living room where the Kennedy children once debated at dinner became a place where national security decisions were discussed. The other houses on the compound, John's and the one designated for Robert, also needed upgrades. The entire 6-acre property became a secured presidential facility during summer months, with local police coordinating with the Secret Service and Coast Guard boats patrolling offshore. The press corps established a constant presence. Hotels filled with journalists. Photographers waited at the gates. Every movement was documented: John sailing, Jackie and the children at the beach, Caroline riding her pony. The Kennedys at play became national news, exactly as Joe Sr. had envisioned. Images from Hyannis Port appeared worldwide in Life, Look, and international magazines, projecting youth, vigor, beauty, optimism, American royalty in a summer palace. Jackie struggled with the exposure. Privacy disappeared. Cameras followed her everywhere, analyzing her clothes and copying her hairstyles. She escaped when she could to Rhode Island, Virginia, anywhere that offered relief. But summers at Hyannis Port were expected, and she performed the role of president's wife. The children adapted more easily. Caroline, born in 1957, and John Jr., born weeks after the 1960 election, grew up with the Secret Service as part of daily life. Touch football games continued, now under pressure and scrutiny, becoming public spectacle that showcased Kennedy athleticism. John used the compound strategically. When tensions were high, images of him sailing off Cape Cod projected calm, youth, and optimism. The sailing was genuine, one of the few places he could feel space and near privacy. Even with agents following in another boat, visitors ranged from family to world leaders. British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan came. Military advisors and cabinet members flew in for strategy sessions. National business was conducted where family life once ruled. The religious aspect complicated matters in a traditionally Protestant area, but pride and economic benefits outweighed discomfort. Rose Kennedy thrived as visitors paid respects to the president's mother, and she spoke publicly about raising successful children. Then, in December 1961, Joe Sr. suffered a massive stroke while golfing in Palm Beach. Partially paralyzed and severely impaired in speech, he was brought back to Hyannis Port to recover, wheelchair-bound, able to watch what he had built, but no longer direct it. Robert became John's closest advisor, and the partnership that defined the presidency was cemented during long conversations at the compound. Joe spent hours on the porch, positioned to observe arrivals and departures, witnessing his son conduct business and his grandchildren play, frustrated by his silence. The compound became a gathering place for the extended family. Robert from Hickory Hill, Eunice, Patricia, Jean, and Ted, now a senator himself. Yet security and attention changed the atmosphere. Everything became image management. Jackie's frustration grew. She took separate trips abroad, and her discomfort at Hyannis Port was sometimes visible. John noticed but could not abandon the image the presidency required. The children provided authenticity. Caroline and John Jr. playing on the beach were real, unforced moments the press loved. By summer 1963, the routine was set. The rocking chair on the porch became iconic, symbolizing thoughtful leadership as John read briefs and made calls. The compound represented the peak of Kennedy power. 3 generations gathered where Joe had established their legitimacy. Despite serious challenges, Cuba, Vietnam, civil rights, the summer of 1963 felt manageable, even permanent. Long days, warm weather, family togetherness, and quiet confidence suggested the dynasty was secured. Jackie brought the children to the Cape in early September before returning to Washington. The summer season ended. They would return next year, or so it seemed. No one knew that within months, everything would change. That Hyannis Port would shift from summer White House to a site of national mourning, that the images of happiness would become reminders of loss. The peak was also the last moment before the fall. 2 months later, nothing would ever be the same. Chapter 10, November 22, 1963. The compound went dark. Rose Kennedy was at church, St. Francis Xavier in Hyannis, attending the Friday morning Mass she rarely missed, a routine she had kept for decades. Faith had carried her through the loss of Joe Jr. and Kick, and she trusted it would carry her through whatever came next, though she did not yet know that something terrible had already come. Ted Kennedy was presiding over the Senate in Washington, a routine Friday duty that left him bored and going through the motions, until an aide rushed in and whispered urgently. Ted's face changed. He left immediately for the Senate cloakroom to make phone calls. Back in Hyannis Port, staff were cleaning the main house. The family wasn't there. The president was in Texas on a political trip, Jackie with him. The compound was quiet, nearly empty, with only maintenance staff and a reduced Secret Service presence. The news broke first on television, bulletins interrupting regular programming. Shots fired in Dallas, the president hit, rushed to the hospital, condition unknown. Networks scrambled amid confusion and contradictory reports until the confirmation came. President Kennedy was dead. Ted reached Rose by phone after she returned from church. Their conversation was brief. Rose said she would pray. What else could she do? Another son was dead, the 3rd child she had lost. She went back to church. Joe Sr. was in his room at the compound, the stroke leaving him able to understand but barely able to speak. A nurse sat with him as the television showed the coverage. He watched his son's body removed from the hospital, saw Jackie in her pink suit stained with blood. He could not express what he felt. His face contorted, tears came, sounds but no words. The nurse held his hand. There was nothing to say anyway. His son, the president, the culmination of everything he had built, had been shot in Dallas. The compound filled rapidly as the Secret Service flooded back and family members converged from different places. Robert drove up from Washington with Ethel. Eunice came. Patricia came. Jean came. The Kennedy siblings gathered as they always did in crisis, back to the compound, back to where it had all started. The press surrounded the gates with cameras and reporters, but kept their distance. Even journalists knew this was not the time for questions. They filmed arrivals, captured images of the Kennedys returning home in grief, but did not intrude further. Inside the main house, the family gathered in the living room where they had shared so many dinners, where Joe Sr. had quizzed his children, where they had debated and competed. Now they sat in silence. What was there to say? Robert was devastated. He and John had been closest partners in the presidency, speaking every day. Now John was gone, and Bobby was expected somehow to continue as Attorney General under Johnson to carry on. But how? Ted was the last brother, 29 years old, the youngest of the Kennedy sons, long protected from the pressure Joe Sr. had put on the others. Now he was the only Kennedy son left, and the weight was crushing. Rose maintained her composure through faith. God's will, she had said when Joe Jr. died, when Kick died, and she said it again now. God had called John home, and she would accept it. Her grief was private, processed through prayer. She would not break publicly. Joe Sr. could not maintain composure because he could not speak. The sounds he made were anguished. Staff tried to comfort him, but nothing helped. He had built everything around his sons' political careers. 2 were dead, 1 remained. The dynasty he had envisioned was collapsing. Jackie arrived 2 days later. She had refused to change out of the blood-stained pink suit when she returned to Washington, but by the time she reached Hyannis Port, she had finally changed into a black dress and veil. She brought Caroline and John. The children needed to be with family. The compound became the place where America's first family processed a national tragedy in private. The funeral would be in Washington, the burial at Arlington. But before and after, the Kennedys were at Hyannis Port, where they always came in crisis. The empty bedroom in John's house on the compound was unbearable. Jackie could not stay there. Too many memories, summers, children playing, John working as president. She stayed briefly, then left with the children. She could not be at the compound anymore. Photographs of John were everywhere. On the porch in a rocking chair, sailing, playing with Caroline and John Jr., images that had once represented success and now represented loss. The compound was filled with ghosts. The helipad built for presidential arrivals sat empty. The communications equipment that had linked the Summer White House to Washington was dismantled. The Secret Service presence diminished. What had been the center of presidential power was just a family estate again, marked by death. Robert wandered the grounds, the dock where they had sailed, the lawn where they had played football. Everything reminded him of John. They had grown up here together, competed here, learned here. Now John was gone and Bobby was lost. The younger Kennedy generation was confused. Caroline was 5 and understood her father was gone, but not fully what that meant. John Jr. was 2 days short of his 3rd birthday, too young to understand. The cousins tried to make sense of it. Their Uncle Jack, who had been president, was dead. The compound's meaning shifted again. It had been a training ground, then a power center, then a summer White House. Now it was a memorial. Every room held memories of John. Every space echoed with his absence. The flag flew at half-mast and would stay that way for weeks. The compound that had projected Kennedy optimism and vigor now projected grief. News crews captured images from outside the gates of a darkened, quiet place where the energy was gone. Visitors came to pay respects. Politicians who had worked with John, friends from the PT boat crew, people whose lives he had touched. The family received them in the main house. Condolences were offered, stories shared, but nothing helped. John was gone. Joe Sr. sat in his wheelchair and could not stop crying. The nurse wiped his tears, but they kept coming. He had lived to see his son become president, and now he had lived to see that son murdered. The cruel mathematics of loss, leaving him having outlived 3 of his 9 children. The patriarch watched his dynasty die piece by piece. Rose tried to comfort him, but Joe was beyond comfort. The stroke had taken his ability to express himself. The assassination had taken his will to try. He sat in silence, broken only by sounds of grief he could not articulate. The compound would never be a summer White House again. That possibility died in Dallas. The house where a president had worked, hosted world leaders, and made decisions affecting millions was just a house now, filled with sadness. Thanksgiving came days after the funeral. The family gathered at Hyannis Port as they always did for holidays, but the gathering was hollow. The empty chair where John should have sat was unavoidable. The children tried to play normally. The adults tried to function. Neither succeeded. Robert considered leaving politics. What was the point? His brother was dead. The dream was over, but family and advisors pressed him to continue. The Kennedy legacy could not end. Someone had to carry on. Robert remained, but his heart was not in it. Not yet. December brought Joe Sr.'s 75th birthday. There was no celebration. How could there be? His son had been murdered weeks earlier. Joe sat in the main house, unable to speak, watching his family struggle to process grief. The man who had pushed them all so hard could offer no guidance now. He could not speak at all. The compound in winter was always quiet, but the winter of 1963 was different. Not just quiet, but heavy. The weight of loss hung over everything. The houses, the grounds, the beach, the dock, all marked by what had happened in Dallas. Palm Beach was no escape. The family went there for winter as usual, but the Florida estate lay under the same shadow. Joe Sr. sat by the pool in his wheelchair, the same pool where he had held court for decades and planned his son's political careers. Now mostly silent, except for labored breathing and occasional sounds of grief. Jackie tried to build a new life, buying a house in Georgetown, planning the Kennedy Library, focusing on her children, but she was forever marked by Dallas. The blood on her suit, the loss. Nothing would ever be normal again. The compound stood as a reminder of what had been. The summer White House, the peak of Kennedy power, that moment in 1963 when everything seemed possible, when a young president sailed and played with his children and governed from his family estate. All of it was gone, murdered in Dallas. The compound could no longer be that place. It could only be where the Kennedys came to remember and to grieve.